Christopher Columbus did not discover America. Not even close. By the time he landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he was roughly 500 years late. And the people who got there first didn't stumble onto it by accident, didn't have royal funding, didn't have a fleet of ships, and didn't get a holiday named after them. They were Norse. They came from the freezing edge of the known world. They crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden boats. And we know they made it because we found their camp. Not a rumor, not a saga, an actual physical settlement sitting in the ground in Newfoundland, Canada, confirmed by archaeology, carbon dated, and visited by tourists who now walk exactly where Viking boots walked 1,000 years ago. This is the story of how they got there, why they left, and why the world forgot about it for 5 centuries.
How you build an empire without meaning to. To understand how Norse explorers ended up in North America around 1000 CE, you need to understand something about how Norse expansion worked. It wasn't planned, not really. It was a chain reaction, each step forced by the last. It starts in Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, where the coastline is dramatic and the farmable land is narrow. Population grows, land gets scarce, and when land gets scarce, people with boats start looking elsewhere. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Norse settlers had already pushed out to the Faroe Islands, a cluster of tiny, windswept rocks in the North Atlantic that nobody else particularly wanted. Then Iceland. Then in 985 CE, a man named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, because sometimes history just gives you a name that fits perfectly, and he sailed west. He found Greenland, established a colony, and started telling everyone back in Iceland that Greenland was a lush paradise, which was either optimistic marketing or a flat-out lie, depending on how you feel about subarctic tundra. People moved there anyway, which is how, a few years later, Greenland had enough settlers to hear the next part of the story.
The accidental sighting. Around 985 or 986 CE, a Norse trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland to visit his father. He got blown off course by storms. He drifted for days. And then, through the fog, he spotted land. Land that was not Greenland. Land with trees and gentle hills. Land that looked nothing like the rocky, glacier-scraped coastline he was expecting. Bjarni looked at it, decided it wasn't Greenland, and sailed away without landing. He never set foot on the continent that was sitting right in front of him. When he finally reached Greenland and told people what he'd seen, the reaction was roughly what you'd expect. You saw an unknown land and didn't stop? What is wrong with you? Bjarni shrugged. He had cargo to deliver. But the story spread, and a few years later, a man named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, apparently the entire family built their legacy on showing up to places, bought Bjarni's boat, retraced his route in reverse, and actually landed.
Leif Erikson arrives. The Norse sagas, oral histories written down centuries later, describe Leif making contact with 3 distinct regions on his westward journey. The first was a flat, rocky, glaciated place he called Helluland, stone slab land, almost certainly Baffin Island. The second was forested and sandy. He called it Markland, likely Labrador. The third was where he stopped, a place with wild grapes, good timber, and a river teeming with salmon so large his crew reportedly couldn't believe what they were seeing. He called it Vinland, and he built a settlement there and wintered over. For centuries, this was treated as legend, a good story, Viking mythology, because nobody had found Vinland. Nobody had found any physical evidence that Norse explorers had made it to North America at all. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeological wife Anne Stine Ingstad did something simple that everyone else had apparently not thought to try. They went looking. The discovery at Lance aux Meadows. Helge Ingstad had a theory.
If Norse sailors were navigating by following coastlines and island hopping across the North Atlantic, Scandinavia to the Faroe Islands to Iceland to Greenland, the logical next step west would bring them to the northern tip of Newfoundland. So he went there. He talked to local fishermen. One of them, a man named George Decker, took him to a place the locals called the Old Indian Camp. There were bumps and depressions in the grass that nobody had ever paid much attention to. Ingstad paid attention. They started excavating, and what they found ended the debate permanently. 8 Norse-style buildings, turf walls, a forge, iron nails, a bronze cloakpin of distinctly Norse design, a small stone oil lamp identical to ones found in Greenland, a spindle whorl, a tool used for spinning wool, which told archaeologists that women had been there, meaning this wasn't a brief scout or a hunting camp. This was a settlement people intended to stay in. Carbon dating put it at around 1000 CE, half a millennium before Columbus. The site is now called L'Anse aux Meadows. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America. Proven, physical, inarguable. The sagas weren't legend. They were field notes.
What happened after they arrived? Leif's expedition wintered in Vinland and returned to Greenland. Others followed. His brother Thorvald led an expedition and became the first known European to die in North America, killed in a confrontation with indigenous peoples the Norse called Skraelings, a word that roughly translates to wretches or foreigners, which tells you something about the diplomatic approach. Then came the most ambitious attempt. Around 1009 CE, a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni arrived in Vinland with around 160 people, men, women, livestock, intending to establish a permanent colony. He stayed for 3 years. A child was born there, a boy named Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first known European child born in North America. He was born approximately 483 years before Columbus was. And then they left. Karlsefni's colony failed not because of the land, which by all accounts was genuinely excellent, but because of the people already living on it. The Norse had weapons and tactics that gave them advantages in some confrontations, but they were massively outnumbered. Every year the tensions grew. Every year the raids became more serious. 3 years of trying, and Karlsefni made the call. It wasn't worth dying over. They packed up and sailed home. And after that, Vinland largely faded from active memory. Greenland itself was struggling. The climate was cooling, the colony was shrinking, communication with Europe becoming increasingly rare. There was nobody left to go back, and nobody pushing to try.
The question nobody asks. Here is the part that tends to stop people. If the Norse reached North America 500 years before Columbus, why does Columbus get the credit? Why did his voyage change everything when Ericsson's didn't? The answer is not about who was braver or whose boats were better. It's about timing and about what Europe was ready for. In 1000 CE, Europe was fragmented, communication was slow, and Greenland was the far edge of the known world. Leif Erikson's voyage was remarkable, but information about it traveled the way all information traveled in 1000 CE. Slowly, imperfectly, mostly in the form of stories that got blurrier with each retelling. By 1492, everything was different. The printing press existed. Trade networks connected Europe to itself in ways that hadn't existed before. Spain had the resources and the appetite to fund serious oceanic expeditions. And when Columbus came back, the news spread across Europe within months, not decades. Columbus didn't just find land. He found land at the moment the world was capable of doing something with that information. Ericsson found land 500 years too early for it to matter to anyone outside Greenland, which is, depending on how you look at it, either a tragedy or a testament to bad timing on a civilizational scale.
What we know now. Recent discoveries have pushed the story even further. In 2021, a team of researchers used a rare solar storm recorded in tree rings to precisely date the wood from L'Anse aux Meadows. The result was specific to a single year, 1021 CE. Not a range, not an estimate, a year.
The trees used to build those structures were cut in 1021 CE. That means we now know to the year when Norse people were in North America. And researchers believe Lonzo Meadows was probably a base camp, a staging ground for further exploration south, toward the wild grapes that the sagas describe in Vinland. The actual settlement Leif called home may still be out there, somewhere further down the coast, unexcavated, waiting. The story isn't finished, it's just waiting for someone to go looking again.
The ending. Columbus gets the holiday. Ericsson gets the footnote. But here is what actually happened. 1,000 years ago, a group of Norse sailors loaded into open wooden boats and crossed the North Atlantic by reading stars and ocean currents and the color of the water. They had no compass, no maps of where they were going, no guarantee they would find anything or make it home. They reached a continent nobody in their world knew existed. They built a settlement. They had children. They traded with people who had been living there for thousands of years. And then they went home and told stories about it that the world spent 5 centuries dismissing as myth. Until 2 people with shovels proved them right. Columbus didn't discover America. The people who were already living here did. And the first Europeans to follow them there were Norse, cold and completely unimpressed. Because if you've spent your whole life in Greenland, even Newfoundland in November feels like a reasonable upgrade.